Support for Conversations Live comes from the members of WPSU and from the Environmental Programming Endowment and the Gertrude J. Sant Endowment.
Good evening and welcome to Conversations Live, Get Your Garden On. I'm Ann Danahy. It's fall and that means it's time to prepare your garden for the winter. Tonight, two experts join us to discuss what's on their to-do list for the fall. Plus, we'll hear their insights on the growing season. We'll also get an update on the invasive spotted lanternfly, and we'll take your questions. Let's meet our guests. Tom Butzler is a Penn State Extension horticulture educator. He works with commercial horticulture operations and the landscaping community in Clinton County. His areas of expertise are vegetable production and beekeeping. Tom Ford is also a Penn State Extension horticulture expert and educator. He works with commercial horticulture operations and growers in Cambria County. His areas of expertise include greenhouse and nursery production and fruit trees. You too can join tonight's conversation. Our toll-free number is 1-800-543-8242. Our email address is connect@wpsu.org. Tom Butzler and Tom Ford, thank you both for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
Fall is the season when people are starting to think about putting their gardens to bed, maybe having a little free time in the winter, but it's also a really good time to start planning for the spring. And in particular, I'm thinking of planting bulbs. So we have daffodils, we have hyacinths, we have tulips. Tom Ford, for people who do want to enjoy those in the spring, what should they be thinking about and doing right now?
Probably the most important thing is get your bulbs early, because the longer they're sitting in a garden center or a mass merchandiser, the greater they're going to deteriorate. So fresher is better. And then when you think about planting, we like to try to go ahead and prepare the soil thoroughly. Like to loosen it up a little bit. And then the rule of thumb on planting is usually you want to make sure that your planting depth is about 2 to 3 times the height of the bulb. So if the bulb is an inch in length, basically you're going to go between 2 to 3 inches deep as far as below the soil surface.
Okay, so should people be doing that now? Is this a good month, October?
Usually once we turn the page to October 1, it's bulb planting season. So we need to go ahead and get them done, select our bulbs. We want to make sure that when we're planting bulbs that we plant them in mass. Don't plant them like we say single ranked soldiers in a line.
And that's because it creates a nice effect if you have that big kind of mass.
Right, a drift
flowers
or a mass. And then the other thing that you can do too is some people say, well, what about squirrels and chipmunks and things that possibly could eat the bulbs? Well, there's a couple schools of thought. First off, daffodils are poisonous to most of the rodents. So even if it would ingest, it'll be the last meal they had. So daffodils are a good investment. Tulips are a delicacy for rodents. So with tulips, one of the old tricks of the trade is get those green plastic mesh strawberry boxes that you can go pretty much your local grocery store, get your pint of strawberries, take that little mesh box, plant your bulb in that mesh box, and then plant that at the proper depth. That'll stop the tunneling of many of the rodents that may be coming after your bulb.
Okay, so they'll be good at least until they come up and they get eaten by a deer or something in the spring.
But we do have repellents and such that can work on deer too. But you know, I think the key thing that we have to look at is bulbs do not like wet feet. So avoid wet soils. They're better off in a full sunlight environment. And again, mask them. And daffodils will naturalize. Tulips typically have a little bit shorter life for us in our environment.
When's the last date that people can get those bulbs in? So if someone wants to plant it in October, but for whatever reason, it just doesn't happen, is there an end date when, okay, that's it, you've got to get those bulbs in?
I would rather see you try to get the bulbs in October, but if you have to delay it, November and December are fine. The one thing you don't want to do is put the bulbs in a drawer and forget about them until spring, because if you do that, they're not going to come up.
You won't get to enjoy them. Great advice. So unfortunately, this is also the time of year when we are on the lookout for pests and invasive species. And I'm thinking about the spotted lanternfly, and that's causing a lot of concerns this year in Pennsylvania as it's moved into some areas and there's quarantines on some places, concerns about it. Tom Butzler, can you bring us up to speed on where things stand with the spotted lanternfly, what people should be looking for, and where the areas of concern are?
Sure. So for those folks looking on the screen right now, it's an immature with it's black with white dots. And right now, central Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania is kind of not facing the wrath of this insect. It's really relegated to the eastern part of the state, and I think it's 13 counties that are under a quarantine. And some of the counties in the surrounding states also have a breeding population. So there is an extensive effort to kind of keep it contained until the research catches up, maybe with some biological control mechanisms, maybe some insecticide sprays, things that might keep it contained. There is a big concern with this insect because of the damage it's can do to our agriculture industry. And so what we're encouraging folks to do is recognize the different life stages of this insect. So on your screen right now you see the egg life stage. In the lower left-hand corner is the little eggs. It's typically covered with a gray mass, a material to kind of give it some protection over the winter. And then those eggs will hatch out in the spring. But right now we're dealing with the adults and their egg-laying capabilities. So that's kind of the stages we're seeing right now. The adult, very colorful. It's not a real aggressive flyer. Its movement really is hitchhiking on either people, clothes, well, not necessarily clothes, but on equipment, vehicles. And so that is really how we think it's going to spread outside this quarantine zone. And again, the emphasis is trying to limit the damage to the agriculture industry. So in the picture that's showing up on your screen now is a mass of adult spotted lanternflies on a grapevine. And these have piercing, sucking mouthparts that are sucking out the juices of the tree, the sap, the vine here in this case. It's going to weaken the plant, but it also, as it feeds, it's excreting a lot of material underneath it, and it gets kind of sticky and it gets black over time, and it really degrades the quality of the products, some of these agricultural products, especially in the grape industry.
So that's where the damage could come in. So right now we've got the spotted lanternfly, and it's still kind of in that fly stage, but if you don't see it now, you want to keep on the lookout to see it in the egg mass?
Right. So right now those females are actively laying eggs, and eventually they will die off with this colder weather. And what will be left behind in the the late fall and through the winter will just be that egg stage. And so if that's something that we see, at least in central Pennsylvania or the western part of the state, you do need to contact the authorities so that we can kind of start manning up an effort in this part of the state. Once you report it, then you'd want to scrape it off, maybe bottle it if they need a specimen, or just eliminate it. Okay,
so if you're in an area where it doesn't have a large presence yet, you want to make sure that you report it, try to keep it at bay for as long as possible.
That's correct. Penn State has a website, a very extensive website with a lot of fact sheets, pictures showing the life cycle, some calendars showing the different life stages. So for those folks that aren't familiar with it, it's a great resource, but there are also some phone numbers for contact, as does the PDA, Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, has some contact information and some other life cycle information.
So great. And right now it's the fall season and people are starting to think about putting their gardens to bed. What are some tips that you have for people who want to start wrapping things up? We'll start with you, Tom Butzler.
Okay. Well, the garden is slowly dying off or senescing. I guess the first thing is to make sure that you get some of the stuff out of the garden that's still kind of hanging on. Here in central Pennsylvania, the first frost is middle of October, I think. And so you might want to go out and harvest some of those tomatoes that are still on the vine, bring in some of the winter gourds, get them out so they can cure properly, and then stay 3-4 months in some sort of storage area. So harvest what's left out there, and then start putting it to bed. Could be removing the stakes, the trellis system. It could mean at this point you still have time to put in a cover crop. Put something down so that the soil remains in place. Some of the nutrients are captured and saved over to the following growing season.
Tom Ford, what do you think? What would you tell people who are getting ready they should have on their checklist for the fall?
Well, one of the first things to me is the soil testing. Because first off, we think about lawns, we also think about vegetable gardens as well. When you think about the average vegetable garden, most of the crops we grow like to have a higher soil pH, usually 6.2, 6.5. When you start dealing with things like potatoes, though, they like a pH around 5.2. So there's a variation in pHs, but if a home gardener just routinely puts lime down, they may increase the pH so high that it encourages scab on potatoes, or it causes micronutrients to be tied up. In the home lawn situation, if we have to increase the pH to a 6.2, 6.5 level, lime takes about 6 months to work. So it's very important that a home gardener get that soil test done now so the appropriate amendments can be applied prescriptively to get that core benefit for next spring.
Okay, interesting. So you don't want to just wait till spring and think you can do it. So while we're talking a little bit about some of the steps that you can take to get ready for the spring, why don't you give us a call, 1-800-543-8242. This is Conversations Live on WPSU, and we're getting some tips on having a great garden season in the fall and moving into spring too. So you want to make sure you're testing your soil pH. What about weeding? Do you really need to get into the weeds literally and weed it? Or sometimes it seems like, oh, I could just kind of maybe put some mulch on top of it and call it a day. Is there a better approach for that?
Well, a lot of the weeds that we solved this past summer are basically summer annuals. So the first hard frost is going to kill a majority of them. If we have any winter annuals or if we have any perennial weeds, the perennial weeds could be a problem next year for us. But a lot of those winter annuals and such, if you're going to till or plow that garden down, you're going to mitigate a lot of the weed growth anyways. But mulching would be a good idea. It keeps the soils a little warm. It may keep the soils a little more friable, so they're easy to work. There are some home gardeners who do not want to practice tillage. And what they'll do is they'll scavenge cardboard appliance boxes. And they'll cut them to large sheets and lay them over their garden when their garden's finished for the season. And chokes out the weeds, and next spring they flip the cardboard over and basically plant without doing any type of tillage.
You're good to go. So what's the disadvantage of tilling now? So some people don't like to do that. They just kind of want to let it rest. Any problems with that?
There's two schools of thought on that. There's folks that really kind of like to bust up that soil, get it really kind of loose, but it does destroy some of the soil structure, maybe dry it out quicker, maybe interfere with some of the microorganism activity there. So there is some folks out there that like to keep things in place, as Tom mentioned. But when you do till the soil, it does allow you to work in the organic manner. Let's say you're using a cover crop or you're putting some compost or mulch on. If you work it into the soil, it does build up that soil structure a little quicker. Some people use it as a means of weed control. You have some germinating weeds. One way to mitigate that prevent that weed from growing any further is basically to till it under or disturb its root structure. There's some pros and cons with that one.
And I also understand there's kind of pros and cons with some weeding too. There's the school of thought that, hey, maybe it's good to leave some of those plants and their seeds there because those are good for the birds and for other animals. And if you pull everything out, uproot it, and take it away, then there's nothing left for the birds. Any truth to that?
As Tom mentioned, most of the weeds that in the garden right now are your summer annual weeds. They will be dying off. You could let them stand for birds. You will have some of those seeds drop off in the soil. They'll be able to survive the winter. And if you don't do anything, that could be a major problem in the spring. But as Tom had mentioned, he had mentioned this term mulch. If you put down some sort of mulch in the spring as you're planting, late spring or summer, that will prevent a lot of those weed seeds from germinating. Or if they germinate, they just can't see the sunlight and they eventually die off. So you could leave those weeds around. Just be aware that you need to take some action in the spring to prevent that from being just a jungle out there. And so the term is mulching in the planting season.
Right.
There's another issue too, is pathogen reduction, because there are certain pathogens, certain diseases we've seen come in on vegetable crops. And so by incorporating those organic residues, in some situations we may reduce that pathogen from carrying over for the following season. So in some cases, tillage may be recommended.
Okay.
With corn, for example, there's an odd disease we've been seeing more frequently called Diplodia ear blight. And it's usually seen in sweet corn fields where they use no-till with commercial fields. The number one recommendation to control it is tillage. And of course, we try to minimize tillage today because we're worried about health of things like the Chesapeake Bay.
Sure.
We're worried about soil erosion. But there are times where tillage may be the best practice.
You don't want to, one reason you want to avoid tillage in some cases is to prevent some of that runoff into the
That's
waterways, but sometimes it is the better way to go. And just talking a little bit more about mulching, so you can mulch your garden bed, try to keep the weeds down and kind of give it some nourishment for this spring. What about your trees and your flower beds? What's the best approach for that?
Well, the first thing is that majority of people overmulch, especially when you think about trees and shrubs. All of us have seen the volcanoes of mulch in commercial landscapes. That should be the best how-to video on how not to do it. We have a photograph right here. We've seen in some cases where I've seen 18 inches, 24 inches of mulch placed up around the tree. It does two things. It encourages collar rot. It impacts the depth of rooting. And in some cases could encourage surface rooting, which then that surface rooting can then turn into a girdling root, which can basically encircle the trunk of the tree and kill the tree. So it can be very traumatic and end up resulting in the loss of your plant material.
So the root actually starts to grow around the tree.
We also see it if a tree was grown in a round pot. A lot of times that circular root pattern is maintained. And we see the horror stories. Tom and I both get called out to sites. You can see an entire street tree planting where the trees are dying. They're trying to blame the gas company in some cases. It's a gas leak. It's why all the trees are dying. And you see girdling roots the size of your arm wrapped up around the trunk, basically constricting the vascular tissue. And as it constricts the vascular tissue, the tree starts to die.
So make sure you leave enough room for those roots to grow well. If you're just joining us, I'm Ann Danahy, and this is Conversations Live, Get Your Garden On WPSU TV, FM radio, and online at wpsu.org/live. Joining us tonight are Penn State Extension horticulture educators Tom Butzler and Tom Ford. Our toll-free number is 1-800-543-8242, and our panel is ready to take your calls. You can also send us questions by email at connect@wpsu.org. So we've been talking a little bit about the wrong way to mulch. What is the right way to mulch? When you're mulching the trees, what do you want to do?
No more than 2 to 3 inches of accumulated mulch, which means you don't add 2 to 3 inches each year. You basically, when you look at that depth of mulch, it should be 2 to 3 inches, no more. There should be no mulch coming in contact with the bark of a tree or a shrub. They're the key areas. The mulch should be flattened out over an area, never mounded up against the trunk.
Okay, never the dreaded mulch volcano.
Right.
What about lawns? Do we want to do anything to take care of our lawn in the fall? Is this a good time to reseed or fertilize? What's the best approach?
This is the best time to take care of your lawn. I mean, in Pennsylvania, we grow what we call cool season grasses. So they grow actively in the spring and actively in the fall. They go somewhat dormant in the summer. So right now, Tom had mentioned soil testing for the garden, and I think he also said the lawn too. It's a great time to take those soil tests for the lawn, but it's also a good time if you got some threadbare sections in the turf. It's a good time to do some seeding, or a good time to do some aerification, where you're taking little small cores out of the lawn. It's a destructive practice. It's something you do in the fall when the grasses are actively growing, but it relieves compaction. You can top dress it. You can get some organic matter down into that rooting zone. So it really improves the health of the soil. And then finally, if you've got some weed issues in the lawn, it's a good time to deal with some of those weeds as they're translocating material down into the roots. It would be very effective at that time.
And you mentioned aerating. So is that the same as just kind of poking some holes in the yard, or do you actually have to make sure some of the dirt comes out?
Yeah, so there is some equipment that you can roll over the lawn. It just pokes hole, and that's really not very effective. It probably does more negative things to your lawn than beneficial. The idea is that you have something that goes down into the rooting zone of the turf and pulls up cores, dirt, and little bits of root, and it kind of tosses it up on the soil surface. It looks kind of bad at first. It almost looks like you had a visit from a goose. What do you call a grouping of geese?
Again.
A flock. There you go. That visited, because it looks almost like goose droppings. But over time, that tends to break apart, and it kind of works its way back down into the soil where you had the cores removed. So it is destructive, looks kind of rough initially, but for long term, it really improves the health of a lawn.
Aerating and seeding it. Okay. So also in the fall, this is when we've got the leaves coming down on the lawn, and there's different schools of thought on this too. There's people who are like heavy duty raking. They're going to rake the lawn. And then there's also people who think, no, you want to let the leaves go in with the yard, maybe mow them, serve as a natural fertilizer. What are the pros and cons on that, Tom?
So are there any kids listening to this show? They probably don't want to hear the cons to this, so they can use that as an argument to not go out and rake the leaves. But I think there's a lot more pros to raking leaves than cons. When some of these mature trees, when they drop their leaves, there's a lot of leaves on that on the ground there. And as I mentioned before, our cool season grasses are actively growing in this cool weather. And so with those leaves falling on that surface there, it's going to really reduce photosynthesis and potentially weaken that stand of grass. And the other thing is, we get a rain spell, rainy weather, those leaves will tend to mat down and almost act like a mulch, and it could kill. I mean, I've seen in situations where if those leaves are not removed, it will kill that grass underneath.
Forming a blanket almost on the lawn. Okay.
If it's a light enough leaf drop, just run the lawnmower over it and shred them up. I mean, it will add some nutrients to the soil, some organic matter over time. But just to leave leaves lay on the surface of the lawn, I don't think is a good idea.
Okay.
Yeah, and the other thing is pathogen removal again, because we look at 2 springs in a row, we had very wet weather. We saw a lot of anthracnose, a lot of tar spot. There are diseases that cause premature leaf drop in things like maples and oaks. So if those leaves are remain there through the winter, they will sporulate in the spring and potentially start that infection cycle back over.
Okay, so the downside to that too. Okay, well, it looks like we're getting a caller. We have Lenny from Blairsville calling. Hi, Lenny, thanks for calling Conversations Live. What can we help you with tonight?
Over the years, I've practiced no-till in my garden, and this time of year, I prepare the garden for my tomatoes and peppers, and I mulch. And like I said, I don't till. And I have had a bad experience this past spring when I planted my pepper and tomato seedlings. The soil was basically muck, and I still had to plant. It was late May. It didn't look like we were going to frost. I've kept journals on this area I live in, and we generally don't have a hard frost after the 12th or so of May. So I planted, but the plants really struggled to get a start with the soil being so wet, and especially peppers. I know they like dry feet, and I actually just started getting pepper production, so I'm not yanking them out yet.
So you're wondering if it's a no-till.
How do you dry it out when you pre-mulch in the fall?
Well, that's one of the disadvantages with putting that mulch down, is it does conserve that soil moisture, doesn't allow it to dry out. And last year, at least in Center County, I didn't see here Blairsville. I'm sure it was very similar down there. I mean, it was a wet several months, with all the rainfall we had. And so when you have that mulch on that soil surface, that garden surface, it's not allowing it to dry out for some of that water to evaporate off. As to correcting that problem, other than not mulching it, just kind of either pulling it off.
Yeah, probably the best thing would have been just to pull the mulch off temporarily, try to allow it to hopefully dry out a little bit, to pull the mulch back in. Tillage actually may have expedited, at least shallow tillage. I'm not going to say till 6 inches or 8 inches to plow depth, but light, shallow soil movement may expedite some of the moisture. In that time frame, Lenny, you were talking about, up until about the first or second week of June, many of those areas in central and western PA we're about anywhere from 5 to 8 inches over the norm still.
That's true, yep.
So it's a situation we were dealing with, again, an over application as far as rain, and there really wasn't much we could do about it. But all you can do is pull the mulch back, do some shallow tillage to try to expedite some of that moisture loss. And the only other thing would be is possibly mound, create a smaller berm within your garden area, and then plant the tomatoes in that berm. That would give you a little bit better drainage. The peppers in particular, because peppers hate wet feet.
Okay, well, we hope that helps, Lenny. And we also have another call now from Mary in State College. Hi, Mary. Thanks for calling Conversations Live. What can we help you with?
Well, hello. I've been having some pumpkin problems. Last year, I had pumpkin vines, very big and healthy, and many blossoms and blooms, but no pumpkins. And this year, the same thing, big, healthy vines and blossoms. And finally, I did just get 2 pumpkins, maybe 4 weeks ago. And by the way, I'm growing them on black plastic underneath. So I was just wondering if I'm doing something wrong, or was it the weather, or what's happening to prevent pumpkins?
What can she do to get better pumpkins?
I know this year with the growers that I work with and visit, I mean, it was a pretty good pumpkin year.
Yeah.
So I guess a couple of things that might come, I would ask you is, one, when those blossoms were open, did you notice any visitations by honeybees or bumblebees or squash bees, moving that pollen from the male flower to the female flower?
I know, not specifically, but I had bees in my garden, so I thought, well, bees were around, but I can't tell you if they went to the pumpkin blossoms.
Right. So yeah, it sounds like maybe pollination wasn't an issue. I mean, usually if you got bees in the garden, they're probably going to visit those flowers. And I guess the other thing would be, did you apply fertilizer to these pumpkins?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
Sorry.
No. Sometimes where if you put too much nitrogen down, you promote excess of plant growth at the expense of fruit growth. You're promoting vegetative growth instead of reproductive growth. And so sometimes we see that where people put down too much nitrogen or too much compost.
Yeah, compost and manure could be an issue too, and also mushroom substrate.
Yeah.
All three of those things basically can increase excess fertility. If the leaves were healthy, dark green, we say little giant like elephant ears, somehow or other along the line the fertility was too high.
Okay.
But typically it was a good year for pumpkin growers. The other thing, I guess, to comment on that is there are some diseases, and that's something that our growers battle every year, but that necessarily doesn't interfere with fruit production. It might lengthen the lifespan of that plant, but usually fruit is set.
So a couple different variables. So Mary, we hope you have better luck with your pumpkins. And we have another call now from John in Jefferson. Hi, John. Thank you for calling Conversations Live. Get your garden on. What can we help you with?
Hi, guys. I've had problem with blossom end rot on my tomatoes for several years. I was at a show down at State College, and they told me that this disease can be harbored in the soil and not go away. I also, from our home gardening center, I bought some, I guess it's a copper spray that you spray every 7 to 10 days, but you're not supposed to put more than 4 applications on in a season. That seemed to help, but I work out of town, and I'm not readily available, or I forget to make the application of this spray. And you can tell these plants are blighted because far before season for these tomatoes to ripen, habitually every year the plants start to die off. Well, of course, then all the crop on the plant begins to rot. So what can I do to either eradicate this disease or do something different with my fertilization? Now, one thing I was told is I use manure tea. We have horses, and I use manure tea instead of fertilizer most of the time. And someone told me that by overwatering with this rich manure tea, that I could also damage the tomatoes. So there's a couple things for you to get your mind into.
Yeah, there's a lot in that
Yeah.
question there, those comments, and I'll answer part of it, and then Tom can jump in. I'll answer the disease part of it. There are several diseases that occur on tomatoes, a warm season crop, and on the monitor we're seeing one of them, which is late blight on tomato. That one's not one that happens every year. We're seeing it more and more, but it's not every year. But there are others that happen every year. And it's really critical to identify what disease you are dealing with. And then it will help you determine what management practice to take. I mean, we have some fungal leaf diseases. We have some copper leaf diseases. And he mentioned,
Bacterial.
Yeah, bacterial. I'm sorry. So he mentioned, so there's fungal leaf diseases and bacterial leaf diseases. And he mentioned the use of copper, and that is one that was really effective on our bacterial leaf diseases. So it's really critical for him to identify why these plants are dying off. And I suggest maybe contact his local extension office so he can take some samples in. They may not be able to identify it, but at least they can either take some pictures of it and send it off, or send some samples up to Penn State's Plant Disease Clinic. So that's really important to kind of hone in on the problem, and then we can come up with that management strategy. But the other thing that you mentioned, John, was blossom end rot. And even though we kind of classify that as a disease, it's not caused by a living organism.
Yeah, blossom end rot is actually physiological. And when you look at your manure tea, and anytime we also use any other fertilizers, if they tend to be high in what we call ammoniacal nitrogen, it can exacerbate blossom end rot. Blossom end rot is caused by calcium uptake. So it's actually a localized calcium deficiency that appears on that blossom end of the tomato. So uneven moisture, inconsistent moisture, the wrong form of nitrogen, excess applications of potassium, all those things can impact and cause blossom end rot.
So lots of different possibilities. It sounds like he definitely needs to narrow it down, maybe get a sampling and see if he can get some testing done to do that. Okay. If you're just joining us, I'm Ann Danahy, and this is Conversations Live, Get Your Garden On WPSU TV, FM radio, and online at wpsu.org/live. Joining us tonight are Penn State Extension horticulture educators Tom Butzler and Tom Ford. Our toll-free number is 1-800-543-8242, and our panel is ready to take your calls. You can also send us questions by email at connect@wpsu.org. And I think we already have another call. This is from Ashok in State College. Thank you for calling, and what's your question?
Hello, thank you. I did a soil test in my backyard, and I was recommended to put lime and also some fertilizer. But when I put the fertilizer, I put too much, and I have some patches of burnt grass, and I think at least I said I will leave it alone now. So I don't know if is that the best thing to just let it leave it alone now.
Well, probably the best thing to do to try to mitigate the amount of injury you're seeing would be to leach heavily with clear water. Because when you actually overapply a fertilizer, we don't think about fertilizers being salt-based, but they are salts. Right. And when you have too high a concentration of a salt in the root zone, water moves from the plant into the soil to dilute the salt, which causes a chemical burn. So the best scenario we can have for you to try to get some relief and to get some recovery would be to take really copious amounts of clear water and to irrigate thoroughly where the, quote, injury is. Once you have leached it, then what I would do is take a rake, scratch the soil up a little bit, abrase it, and then go ahead and overseed. As long as you've reduced the salt concentration in the soil there, you should be able to go ahead and get the grass to reestablish.
So hopefully that will help. And it looks like
That is great. Thank you.
You're welcome. And we have another question coming in via email. And Frank wants to know, when is the best time to plant garlic? Is it possible to plant cloves purchased in the grocery store? Any garlic secrets that you want to share with us? So can you just go to the grocery store and you buy some garlic and then just put the cloves in? Is that okay? Or Are there any tricks of the trade?
Yeah, I don't know about trying. I guess you could buy garlic in the store and plant it. I mean, it's an excellent time to plant garlic right now into November, early December. But as for store, I've never tried that. I guess it would work.
You could do it. The concerns would be is that a lot of times when we buy garlic in the store, we're buying that little white hard garlic that's in the little package. The quality may not be good as compared to some of the garlic that's been raised specifically for planting. We may actually get some better cultivars, better varieties, more pungent aromas from it. So even though physically and scientifically you can do it, you could probably get better varieties.
Okay, so hopefully that helps. You can do it if you want to. If that's all the garlic you can get your hands on, but maybe try to get something that's specifically made for planting. Well, that's an excellent time to talk about what, if anything, can be planted this time of year. So garlic, onions, is there anything else, or is it really just getting to be too late?
It's really getting to be pretty late. I mean, if you could get some lettuce seedlings that have been started in somebody's greenhouse, you still have a couple weeks of growth with that, I think. Asparagus and rhubarb could be planted. That's for next spring, though. I mean, it's not like you'd be getting that, harvesting anything now. I guess if for the really entrepreneurial gardeners out there, I mean, there are ways to extend the growing season for several weeks, well beyond the frost events, and that's using some of these low tunnels. And so you create this microclimate, and so you could, push that lettuce, spinach, radishes well into late fall or early winter.
Okay.
So there are ways to kind of extend that growing season, but just for the traditional garden, which is kind of opened up to that atmosphere, there's very little at this point. It's getting kind of late.
Time's running out. Okay, unless you want to protect it from the frost somehow.
Right, and there's always the odd vegetables too. There's one we call mache or corn salad. Some people call it lamb's lettuce. You can actually brush the snow off of it and harvest it. It's not grown too frequently in the United States, but in Europe, it's a staple. But that's one that we could plant for, quote, that winter garden.
Okay.
There are other people that, my father was one who would plant turnips. And even if he didn't get a lot of turnips, the idea was then that would become a green manure crop for him.
Oh, okay.
And so we would always get a couple bushels of turnips that we could use basically early winter for the feed the family.
Okay, so for the gardeners out there, they can still get a few more things in to kind of extend the season.
The window's narrowing.
Yeah, if they want to act now. We have another call from Marlene in Morrisville. Marlene, thanks for calling Conversations Live. What can we help you with?
Well, thank you, and good evening to all of you. A great show. I love your show.
Thank you.
And I have a comment on the blossom end rot on tomatoes. I've been gardening for 50 years plus, and I used to have, that was a big problem, and an old-timer told me, you plant 2 calcium tablets with every tomato plant, and you'll never have blossom end rot. And I say, that's exactly what happened. I have never had blossom end rot since I started doing that. So I find that interesting. I thought I'd pass that along.
Thank you, Marlene.
Secondly, if you have too much, my question is, if you have too much clover in your grass, how do you get rid of it? Or what do you do? Should I leave it? It looks pretty, but we made the mistake of putting in a new yard and planting too much clover seed when we did it. And so we have a lot of clover. And we also have moss. So I would like to know if you can tell me what I can do for those 2 problems. And I'm going to hang up and listen to your answer. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Marlene. So clover and moss, 2 different problems.
Right. Well, for the moss one, you typically see moss in a lawn because of a couple different situations. One, it's just too wet. And so, grass isn't really going to grow in that. Moss will kind of cover that empty niche. Or it could be too acidic. And Tom had talked about soil testing, and that's one way to alleviate that issue is by, with the proper pH. And the third one is dense shade. Okay. So, most of our grass is really like a lot of sunlight. Not a lot, but they need sunlight. And if it's not there, then something else will grow there, and then moss typically moves in. So those 3 issues right there could easily address the moss issue. As for the clover one, I guess Either one, accept it. I mean, there are a lot of pollinators that visit that. I mean, one issue I hear with some homeowners is that their kids are running around. You got all those flowers in the turf, and then a kid would step on a clover that's being visited by like a honeybee.
Oh, a bee, so a higher risk of getting stung by a bee, possibly.
Possibly. I mean, it's kind of a rare occurrence or event. But either start over by just killing everything in the lawn and then reseeding, or applying a selective herbicide that goes after broadleaf weeds, which clover is, and allowing that grass to kind of grow up through that dead clover.
She also said they're kind of pretty, though, so I mean, in a way, you might be safe. There's no harm in it, or
no, there's not. I mean, the thing with clover is that it aesthetically it may not look perfect, but it is supplying nitrogen to that grass that's growing around it. So, and then it's serving as a nectar source for these pollinators, honeybees and others. So, I mean, there's a lot of benefits to it. I think at some point maybe we need to start accepting some of these lawns that maybe don't look the greatest, but we're getting some other benefits from it.
Right.
The other thing is too, if she's against using chemistries, raising the mower height, letting the grass grow a little taller, adjusting the mower height to 3.25 inches. You may get some shading of that clover and make the clover less competitive. And the other thing is, as Tom alluded to, moss is an opportunist. Something's usually not right with the soil. So start with a soil test.
Yeah.
She may need the lime, she may need to apply more phosphorus, but if she makes the grass more competitive, that'll make the clover less competitive.
Okay.
It won't eliminate it,
but it will reduce the competitiveness.
Okay, some great advice there. And we have another call. This is from Susan in State College. Hi, Susan. Thanks for calling Conversations Live. Get your garden on. What can we help you with?
Well, I'm curious about the application of mushroom manure on flower beds. Pittsburgh seemed to use this all the time, and when I moved here, nobody seemed to use it. I tried it this last fall and had really good luck with this, but I'm just wondering what they think about mushroom manure being used as a mulch in the fall.
Okay, great question. So mushroom manure, what is that, and do you recommend it, Tom Ford?
It's what we call spent mushroom substrate. And so when a mushroom house turns over, what they grew the mushrooms on as a substrate is considered a waste product. So it enters typically the landscape supply yards, and then it's sold and distributed. The downside of using mushroom substrate can be the soluble salts levels. Okay, we don't think about it, but there is a soluble salts level, elevated soluble salts, that can actually cause plant injury, just like our previous caller saw with fertilizers and lawns. So the key issue is use it in moderation. If someone puts 2 to 3 inches down, like we suggested with mulch, that could be significantly bad for herbaceous plant material. So we would rather see a light top dress or incorporation in, a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, but not the 2 to 3 inches that we sometimes recommend with hardwood bark mulches.
Okay, great advice. So don't overdo it if you're going to use it.
Yes.
Right, great. And we have another call. This one is from Rick in Johnstown. Hi, Rick. Thanks for calling. And what's your question?
My question basically is as far as like watering your plants, if you're not blessed with like a well to water your plants, you have to use city water. How would that affect the plants? Like if there's any effect, especially if you're on like the tail end of the line of the water system, and you do all the chemicals and poisons or whatever, how would that affect your plants?
So where the water is coming from, is that an issue that you need to be concerned about if it's in the...
Yeah, like a lot of people aren't blessed with a well that they can have clean water, but you have to use city water to water your plants. So how would that...
Tom, I couldn't hear.
Thanks for your question, Rick. I think what Rick was asking about is where the water comes from, if it's from a well or if you're at the end of a line. Does where it comes from, is that going to affect the quality of it?
Almost any water source can have potential consequences, okay? When we think about well water, we don't think about the amount of calcium carbonate that's in the water supply. If we have elevated calcium carbonate in a well, that's actually, when you water, you actually put a dose of limestone around your plants. Every time you water, it raises the pH and ties up iron. When you look at a public water supply, a lot of times they keep the pH high so that metals don't become available to the people in the home. So sometimes you'll see the pH is elevated as well. The concern would be with something like fluoride, only with fluoride-sensitive plants. When you think about the old traditional spider plant, and we always used to see the brown tips, and people would cut the little brown tips off the spider plant, that's fluoride toxicity. So there are some plants that if a municipal water supply is injecting fluoride, it can injure some plants. Okay. But majority of plants are not impacted by fluoride. At the chlorine levels that are being used in municipal plants, that chlorine's not going to be an issue either. So municipal water is considered to be probably one of the safest water sources for most plant material.
Okay, so are you pretty well okay then to just go ahead and use it? Do you recommend getting it tested, or is it really just if you start to see problems that you would want to get your water tested?
Usually, most municipalities have water testing done. You can ask for a copy of their report. Once in a while, we'll run into a rural water system that's on a well field. And in their situation, they may have very elevated calcium carbonate levels. In Martinsburg, Pennsylvania, is one of the areas I work in, the alkalinity level is like over 300 parts per million. So they're getting a significant dose of limestone every time they irrigate. One client who worries about his turf turning yellow because the high pH ties the iron up, he actually injects dilute sulfuric acid every time he irrigates through his water supply to try to keep the pH artificially suppressed in the soil.
Okay, so it just depends.
All depends.
We have another question, and this one's about oak trees, and Linda sent us an email, and Linda wants to know what causes certain oak trees to produce large quantities of acorns in a given year, and which variety of oak tree is having a massed year in Pennsylvania for fall 2019. So we know that there's some years there's just acorns everywhere, and then some years not so much. What's behind that?
Good question. I'm not sure.
What the squirrels just get lucky some years, I guess.
In my area, in the Blair County area, red oaks have a significant level of acorns this year. They're producing a mass crop. The white oaks in my area are not, but I think it depends on your area. A lot of times it depends on plant stress. If a plant is stressed more, the tendency is you may produce heavily from a reproductive standpoint. The second thing you look at too is if we have very late spring frost, they may actually remove some of those flowers in the oak tree as well. So there are other environmental variables, but I don't look at that there's some message always being sent when we look at a mass crop. Some people say, well, we're going to have a terrible winter because the mass crop's so heavy. A lot of times it's other environmental factors, a lot of times stressors on the plant.
Okay, but hopefully they'll still be okay in the next year.
Yeah. And
we have another call from John in Huntington. Hi, John, thanks for calling Conversations Live, and what can we help you with? Hi, John. I think we've got your TV on the background. If it might be possible to turn that down, that'd be great.
We toilet our dogs in one particular area of the yard, and I presume there's...
So we have an issue with the dogs and whether if you're taking the dogs out, and are they going to cause problems on the lawn?
Right.
With the salt buildup.
Right. It's the same situation that Tom talked about a couple callers ago about the over-fertilization of a lawn and they got the burning. And that fertilizer is a salt. And so also with in the urine stream or the urine coming out of a pet animal, there's a salt in there. And if it does it in the same spot where you've trained it to go to the bathroom in a specific area, that salt builds up in the soil. And it will kill everything in close proximity, turf or whatever plants are there. And again, the only way to correct that is have that dog trained to go maybe elsewhere, vary its routine, or to drench that area with water, or hope for a wet fall to drain those salts out of there.
Okay, so the same type of issue and the same types of solution to rinse it out.
Same as the fertilizer
right.
Tom talked about.
And the only other thing possible is an application of gypsum. Gypsum is 40 pounds per 1,000 square feet. We use that with salt injury from de-icing compounds. And so that's another option if, for whatever reason, they're not able to leach effectively.
And we have a call from Charles in Kane. Hi, Charles. Thanks for calling Conversations Live. What can we help you with?
Well, we have a dehumidifier in our basement, and I collect the water out of it during the summer, and we've been using it to water our plants. We have container plants on our deck and that, and I'm just wondering if that's a bad idea due to the chemicals that are in the metal that's in the dehumidifier.
Great question. So it's great. He's reusing the water, or does it cause any problems or issues?
Not that I'm aware of. I do the same thing. I haven't had any burning on my plants.
Yeah, when you're using dehumidifier water, first off, the only thing they warn against is drinking it because of bacterial contamination. But when you think about dehumidified water, it's basically distilled water. There's no minerals in it. The pH is very, I guess you could say, fluid based on what you would add to it. The metals may impart some things as far as if it was zinc or galvanized metal, but as long as the pH in the container around the plants is in that 6, 5, 7 range, it's not going to impact the plants whatsoever.
Okay.
Been doing it for years, never had a problem with any of the house plants. So.
Okay, great. Well, there you go. So while we're on the topic of water, last year we had record rainfall, precipitation in some parts of Pennsylvania, and it's not the same this year, but I'm just wondering, are we still feeling the effects of that? Are you getting calls or questions from people just from all of that precipitation last year and what they're feeling and seeing today, Tom Ford?
We have seen some commercial landscapes where they lost $25,000 to $30,000 worth of plant material because of overly wet soil conditions, which cause a disease called Phytophthora root rot. Yews in particular. We lost conifers and Christmas tree fields. So when we went through the wet season, we ended up seeing some plants unfortunately suffer. So they're suffering. We're going through a dry spell right now. So all that may do is actually expedite the decline of some of those plants that were sort of trying to recover. So the dry conditions are not helping. The wet conditions early in the year definitely didn't help either.
The other thing we're seeing, Tom mentioned some root rots, but in some of our really tight soils, high in clay content, with that extended wet spell that we had for several months, those soils are saturated and remain saturated for a long period of time, and roots do need to breathe. There's an exchange of gases occurring down in that soil. And so when all those air spaces are filled up or pushed out and it's just water, they basically drown. So I saw that with on some of the landscapes with a lot of clay. Normally that would be okay, the water would be able to drain off, but without any rest or break in the wet weather, it really.
Yeah, that can. So hopefully things will continue at a normal level this year and into next year. And we have a call from Mona in Coudersport. Hi, Mona. Thanks for calling Conversations Live. What can we help you with?
Thank you, ma'am. My question is in regard to apple trees. We have quite a few in our yard, and this year it seems like they've lost their leaves early, and some of the trees look like almost like half the tree died, and the apples weren't very good, and they had green spots on them.
Okay.
Ooh.
Yeah, what we saw with apples was apple scab. It's a fungal disease. Basically starts pretty much real close to bud break on apples and then continues to usually about the mid part of May, sometimes early June. The spores are released in the atmosphere. They're called ascospores. And the only way you can prevent apple scab is prophylactic applications of fungicides. Apples, crab apples, apple scab will defoliate except the very tip growth of that apple tree.
And I think part of the reason it was worse, I get the idea that she's calling in because it was really bad this year, is because of the wet weather we had.
From last year.
Right, so this is a disease that likes that wet spring weather right when he was talking about bud break, and it was perfect timing. Some years it's not as bad and those trees can kind of hang on. But yeah, we're seeing a lot of that in our area too, in central Pennsylvania.
And even if she applied a fungicide like Captan is what's used by most home orchardists to prevent apple scab. Captan's a protectant. So if you applied it on Monday, it rained on Tuesday, it's gone.
Okay.
So basically, it made it very difficult to keep your trees protected. And when we talk people Western PA, all the way up to McKean and Potter County this year, everyone has the same phenomena. No leaves on their apple trees by August.
Okay. So
except the commercial growers.
Not alone. We have one more question, and we got an email, and this one is from Linda, and she writes, I recently planted some pawpaw young trees. However, the soil is clay. If I dig it up and add good soil and horse manure, will this help? Is this a good approach to take for the trees?
We generally don't recommend modifying the native soil because you might modify that small little area where the roots are going to grow. But that area outside that root ball or that small modified soil is going to be the native soil, and it's going to be, those roots are going to be kind of adverse into growing into that harsher condition. So the idea is to try to use that native soil. You can kind of modify it a little bit if it's really tight, really clay, but I guess, maybe if possible, digging up plants that have been established, that might be a little rough.
Well, the other thing with pawpaw is a native tree, and when we look at some of the places that they occur naturally, if you go along the Oceano Canal path off the Potomac River, pawpaws have naturalized extensively on the canal, and you're dealing in some cases with floodplain soils. So they're very tolerant of a wide range of soil conditions. And as Tom suggested, if you over-amend that clay soil, it becomes like a bathtub or a flower pot, and you actually be encouraged that tree to create a girdling root scenario which causes that tree to have a short life.
And we have just a few seconds left, so we're going to have our lightning round for advice here. Tom Butzler, what's one thing that you'd like people to take away from tonight?
Well, the planting season is pretty short, not much you can do with that. But, we are heading into the fall, late fall, winter, and it's a great time to go to some of these Master Gardener events that we hold across the state, where we have symposiums on how to garden. So it'd be well worth attendance.
Tom Butzler and Tom Ford, thank you both for talking with us this evening.